With the outbreak of World War I, many nations had entered the modernized conflict with their traditional armies that had not yet adapted to modern warfare. Military technologies and tactics had advanced dramatically during the war as battlefields turned into hellish landscapes of death and destruction never seen before. The Allies and Central Powers would go head-to-head in order to gain a leg up on one another as modern warfare had begun to develop. Warfare had taken a deadly turn as machine guns and artillery would obliterate any exposed soldiers. Both sides had to dig trenches to protect themselves from any direct fire. The trenches would be extremely muddy, disease-ridden, and full of rats. They would be protected by barbed wire and sandbags. Soldiers often spent their time fortifying or standing guard. Only officers were allowed small bunkers for protection, while most men had to make do in small foxholes or just in the trench. When time came for an attack, a whistle would be blown and the men would charge out into no man's land. Weapons like the 1884 Maxim gun propelled the advancements of machine guns. The British Vickers could spray down groups of attacking soldiers with a good fire. Armor was developed for gunners as they would be exposed to enemy fire. Early machine guns were heavy and bulky, so newer guns like the Lewis were developed that could be operated by one man on the move. Same with the American BAR, which also could be carried into no man's land during an attack. Cavalry had been the greatest strength of an army until the Great War. Traditional cavalry charges on the Western Front would be easily countered by enemy machine gun fire. Lines of charging cavalry were cut down and thousands of horses died. They became almost obsolete except for transportation of supplies and cannons. Often soldiers would fight in close quarters during night raids or full-on assaults. Bayonets were the intended weapon but were often put aside as they would make the soldier vulnerable during a thrust, as often the blade would get stuck in their opponent. The American M1897 shotgun was good for close quarters fighting, along with other handheld melee weapons that were used, such as spiked clubs, trench knives with brass knuckles, and whatever else a soldier could find on the battlefield. Artillery had already been advancing for the past 100 years, but the World War I saw the first massive use on an industrial scale. Long gone were the days of old Napoleonic cannons, as heavier, more efficient guns were developed, such as the German 15 Canot 16, which fired 150mm shells that weighed in at 51.4 kilos and could reach out 20 kilometers. Rounds could be fired relatively quickly for their size and would only need one shell to be loaded that already contained the charge and the projectile. The artillery would be placed behind Allied trenches and would be protected from enemy fire. This would allow constant volume of fire that could be used during an attack to break up the enemy. Also, tactics such as using creeping barriers were developed, where artillery would be hitting in front of an Allied attack in order to provide cover. Also, more mobile field guns were developed, such as the French MLE 1897, which shot a 75mm and a 5.4 kilo projectile. It had a lower range but was more mobile. It also was one of the first guns to use a hydraulic mechanism that increased the fire rate and decreased recoil. Artillery brought hell to the enemy. For example, during 3 days in 1917, roughly 5 million shells were fired on a 10-mile front in Flanders. The war saw artillery used on a massive scale, to which the soldiers had to endure through massive amounts of casualties. Political warfare had grown during World War I. The state of the Russian troops was in dismay by 1917, with many deserting from the front due to horrible conditions on and off the battlefield. Morale was low, and Germany was interested in a revolution, pulling Russia from the war. So Germany sent Lenin from Switzerland into Russia in order to instigate the revolution. When the Bolsheviks took power, they signed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty on March 3, 1918, which withdrew Russia from the war and allowed Germany to solely focus on the West in order to have a hope of winning the war. Before World War I, brass-cased ammunition had been developed, and firearms could now reach new levels of speed, accuracy, and efficient design. The British Lee Enfield Mark III had a 10-round internal magazine that could be fired quickly. The M1911 had emerged as the world's best semi-automatic handgun that was reliable and simple in use. The Bergmann MP-18 was the world's first widely adopted submachine gun. Also, the Stahlhandgranate and the Ghost Bomb emerged as the world's first effective hand grenades. Stormtroopers were veteran troops that were equipped and trained to raid enemy trenches and to be the spearhead of any push. These veteran German troops had charged into the Allied defenses in 1918. They would go in the trench, spraying down men with their trench weaponry such as the MP-18, G98AZ, and melee weapons. They had managed to push so hard they almost broke the Allies at Amiens. At the start of the war, most armies had caps. New helmets were developed that were light and still offered some protection. However, the German Pickelhaube was more traditional than functional. One of the first effective helmets was the M15 Adrian. The British began using the Brodie in 1915, but it lacked ear protection. Germany replaced their Pickelhaube with the M16 Stahlhelm. It was the most advanced as it protected the wearer's head and ears. Snipers were heavily used during World War I. Germany had dominated sniper warfare at the beginning of the war. One day, in early 1915, in one segment of the British line, the British had lost 18 men solely due to sniper fire. Snipers also instilled fear in their opponents with the looming danger they posed. Later devices were used to reveal a sniper's position by providing a fake target. Snipers were also equipped with a Sternpanzer, which would protect from rifle fire. German trench parapets were purposely kept messy to camouflage snipers. Rookie snipers were often not well trained and would be easy kills for German snipers. Snipers had to be well trained as only rookies would expose themselves from the trench even for just a few seconds at a time. Sappers, practically army engineers, began digging tunnels during the stalemate on the Western Front. The Battle of Messines had begun planning 18 months earlier, as sappers would have to dig about 8,000 meters of tunnels and plant their explosives. It would be a long process due to German counter-tunneling. At times, sappers would even encounter German sappers, and close-quarters combat would take place in the tunnels. General Plumer, the British general in that region, said, "Gentlemen, we may not make history tomorrow, but we shall certainly change the geography." And on June 7, 1917, as the tunnels had been armed with their explosives, and at 3:10 they exploded, killing approximately 10,000 German defenders. Then the infantry advanced under cover of artillery, tanks, and gas. Planes had begun development before, but World War I had triggered the rapid development of airplanes and aerial warfare. Early planes had been used for spotting or directing artillery on enemy positions. Germany had developed large airships elevated by hydrogen. They were used as terror weapons as they could reach and bomb English cities. The first mounted machine guns on airplanes were on swivels or mounted on the top wing, but this proved hard to aim and reload. In order for machine guns to be mounted best on planes, systems like the synchronization gear, which would trigger the gun when the bullet was clear of the propeller. Every rotation would fire one shot. One of the best fighter planes of the war was the Sopwith Camel that could reach 185 kilometers per hour and was armed with 2 Vickers machine guns. It relied on a system of rigging that, when connected to the control stick, could operate the flaps and tail, giving maneuverability in all directions. Scouting balloons would offer an elevated position for gathered intelligence, but they were still vulnerable to a hydrogen explosion or a loss in gas pressure from enemy fire. Both sides would participate in dogfights in order to gain superiority in the skies, which would lead to the rise of famous aces like the Red Baron. Having control of the skies would allow for new bombers such as the Gotha 5 to have free range for bombing enemy targets, as they would drop 14 25-kilogram bombs. The Gothas were massive with a wingspan of 20.7 meters and 2 machine guns, although they were slow and vulnerable to enemy fighters. New manufacturing possibilities allowed for the building of larger, more powerful battleships. The English HMS Dreadnought, launched in 1906, had immediately outclassed all other ships with its armor, speed, and large cannons. Germany had also begun constructing a large navy in order to compete with the British. In 1916, the Royal Navy and the German High Seas Fleet met at Jutland and fought a massive battle including swaths of modern ships, and after many classes of ships were destroyed, the threat of the High Seas Fleet was destroyed and the Royal Navy had become supreme. The inventions of submarines allowed for naval blockades, stopping countries' shipping routes through stealth. Germany had dominated the field as their U-boats would be able to submerge under the waves through the use of emptying and filling ballasts. They would roam around for weeks looking for enemy ships and then attack when they were unexpected by firing torpedoes to damage the ship's hull. The torpedo would propel itself in a straight line until it hit its target. In order to break the stalemate in Europe, the British command under Winston Churchill had the order for the massive movement of Commonwealth forces into the Dardanelles in order to take Turkey out of the war and meet up with their Russian allies in the east through the Black Sea. The British Navy steamed into the Dardanelles but suffered heavy casualties due to sea mines. Massive amounts of French, British, and Anzac forces had landed on the beachhead after the massive British destroyers had bombarded the Turkish positions. However, they lacked the momentum to push the Turks, who had already dug in. The Allies had to dig trenches, and another stalemate emerged. However, this blunder marked the beginning of naval operations that would mobilize massive amounts of men around the world, leading to newer, widespread conflicts. Cars had been around before the war, but World War I had forced their development into armored gun platforms like the Mark V.
The British Mark V was armed with two 57mm cannons and spontons on the side, much like warships of the time. It also had four Lewis or Hotchkiss guns poking out of holes on various places. The tank was designed to smash through enemy lines in an armored spearhead to break a stalemate. Being the first of its kind, the Mark V was plagued with mechanical problems, and the engine was not nearly sufficient enough to making the tank very slow. And the design of the tracks, combined with its weight, resulted in it getting stuck in the muddy battlefields of World War I.
The German army had little way to combat tanks other than calling in artillery, but inventions like the Tankover that fired a 13.2 by 92mm cartridge that could penetrate early British tanks, and the gunner would have to aim for the crew members. The Geballte Ladung, or bundled charge, was a bunch of German grenades which would do a lot of damage to a Mark V's hull.
Territorial soldiers, they actually panicked. They saw the green cloud coming in, they choked, and then they ran off. But the Germans, when they got to the trench, they pretty much stopped because they didn't want to get the gas either. So it was quite effective the first time out.
Advanced gas masks filtered out the gas and shielded the wearer's face and eyes.
Thing that they used for the gas was they would get these little rags soaked in urine and they would put them on because it would counteract the chlorine. They would file gas shells with regular high explosive shells.
Kids come back and all tore up like they were, shot up, blew up. Just will never leave my mind. That's one of the things about war that is the hardest on anybody is the memories. A lot of it you forget, a lot of the guys you forget. You don't forget a lot of faces, but names kind of drift away. I don't know if that's just the way the Lord made us or if it's just old little brains that's kind of faded away over the years. When somebody come up and said war is hell, they knew what they were talking about.